Kia ora and welcome to this UC Connect lecture tonight. So my name is Karen Pollard and I'm the director of the University of Canterbury Mount John Observatory, which is why you saw all those pretty videos earlier about Mount John. But I'm also the director of the Townsend Observatory here in the Arts Centre, which is our central city observatory and our public outreach site here. So tonight I want to talk to you about the return of stargazing in the city and our efforts to restore the telescope after the damage in the earthquake and to bring it back to the central city site. So I want to give a little bit of a history of the telescope, what we've done in the past, what stargazing has been done with this telescope, and then a little bit about the restoration and finally finishing up with the restored telescope. So 127 years ago, the Townsend Telescope was used for the first time in this central city site. It is here on the right. It's an 8-foot long refractor telescope, and it's, as you can see, it's an equatorially mounted telescope. So a refractor telescope is one that has lenses rather than mirrors as its optical components. The lens at the end is 6 inches in size, and it's an achromat. That means that it corrects for chromatic aberration. It's made of brass and it has finder scopes along the side, and it has brass and wooden mechanisms for doing fine adjustments of the sky. And then here there's 2 wheels attached to the telescope, and these move the telescope around the sky, first in north-south and then in east-west direction. So those are important for moving. It's equatorially mounted, which means that this is the polar axis of the telescope, and that points at the south celestial pole. So if this is south, then the south celestial pole is a certain altitude in your sky, and from Christchurch we're at latitude 43.5 degrees south. So that means that the south celestial pole is 43.5 degrees up in the sky. So the altitude of the pole depends on your latitude on the Earth. So the south celestial pole is the point in the sky about which all the stars appear to rotate in a clockwise direction in the southern hemisphere. And so that point is quite important. So when you have this type of telescope, this is pointing at the south celestial pole, and the telescope tracks. So it slowly moves across the sky, tracking an object across the sky. And that moves in an east-west direction. Okay, so this telescope was made by a very famous telescope maker called Thomas Cook, and it was built in 1864. So Thomas Cook was a very fine optician, and he made quite a few telescopes, and there's quite a few Cook refractors around the world that have been looked after and you can go and visit. But this is one of his early ones. 1864 is a relatively early Cook refractor. This is the mechanism I was talking about before. This is the little clock drive mechanism. So this is the mechanism that drives the telescope across the sky at the same rate the stars move and allows you to follow the stars. So there's a little movie here, hopefully this will work, that shows you this operating. So what you do is you wind up the clock. It has a weight on it, so it pulls down with gravity. And then this little ball governor turns, and that whole thing is a clockwork mechanism that moves the telescope across the sky very slowly, tracking an object. So you don't have to adjust the telescope too much to find objects or to track an object. So this is Graham Kershaw. In 1976, 2 mechanical technicians, Wayne Smith and Graham Kershaw, they refurbished the telescope and they brought it back to as good as new condition in 1976. So at that stage it was operating really well, and at that point we also started employing student observers. We called these observers Townsend observers, and these were usually senior astronomy students that would go out on clear Friday nights, and they would operate the telescope and run public sessions, public outreach sessions. So this is a picture of Graham with the telescope. Graham's first job when he was a teenager, he joined the University of Canterbury Mechanical Workshop in the physics department. His first job was to build the lens cap for this telescope, and he maintained the telescope over the next 50 years. So sorts of things you can see with the Townsend Telescope. These are 3 objects that were taken with a camera taken through the Townsend Telescope. So we have the Moon, we have Jupiter, and a star cluster called the Jewel Box star cluster. And these were taken, as I said, through the telescope by Vincent Thompson. And this is a picture of Sarah Bookums, who was the 2010 Townsend observer, doing some outreach for Matatiki. Okay, so as well as open nights, we would run things like events for Kids Fest, and we would give talks and presentations and run the observing sessions for Matariki. That was until the earthquake happened. Okay, so let's move on and look at some of the history of the telescope. So the telescope was owned by James Townsend, and it's quite interesting about where it actually came from. So we know it was made for Christchurch because the latitude of the plinth shows that the altitude is correct for Christchurch. So the telescope had to have been made for Christchurch. So James Townsend, he arrived with his parents and his 8 siblings on the Cressy in 1850. And here's a picture drawn by his younger sister, Mary Townsend, who is an accomplished artist. And this is a picture of the Cressy arriving in Lyttelton and some of what Lyttelton looked like at that time when the colonists arrived. So he had various jobs during his time in Christchurch, James Townsend, but he was a very, very keen amateur astronomer. So it says here, most people probably are aware that Mr. Townsend is an enthusiast in astronomical matters, and that his residence on Park Terrace has for many years had its distinctive feature in the form of an observatory with the customary dome-shaped revolving roof and a shutter opening skyward. So here's a picture, a photograph of his house in Park Terrace, and out the back there was this observatory that he'd constructed to house his telescopes. He could look at the sun during the day with a special solar filter. He could close up the shutters to make it nice and dark in the observatory, or he could open them up if he needed to at night. So that was where he did a lot of his observational work from, is the back of his house in Park Terrace. So where did the telescope come from? We know it was made for a latitude of Christchurch, and there's very little records of actually where the telescope, when it first came to Christchurch. But I found this newspaper article from 1899, and it was from a colleague of James Townsend, Walter Kidson, who was a surveyor, and he worked a lot with James Townsend. And he said, the telescope had been bought for Mr. Townsend by Sir George Airy. He was the Astronomer Royal at the time. It was used here in 1882, said Mr. Kitson, when observations were taken of the transit of Venus in conjunction with the Inglis expedition. I myself was in charge of Mr. Townsend's telescope in Christchurch, and Colonel Tupman of the English expedition made his observations at Burnham. So this was one observation that was very important, and we'll come back to that soon. But it looks like, from the report, that the telescope was acquired through the Astronomer Royal, and it was acquired so that the transit of Venus could be observed here in Christchurch by James Townsend. So when James Townsend was in his 70s, he decided to donate the telescope to Canterbury College. And so here is the plaque that celebrates that contribute to that donation. And at the same time, the Christchurch Astronomical Society, they had £420 in their kitty, and they donated that money, the entire fund that they had, to the Canterbury College in order to build the tower to house the telescope. So on the plaque it says, a large contribution towards the erection of the tower was made by the Canterbury Astronomical Society. They were actually called the Christchurch Astronomical Society. So that money was donated in 1891, the telescope was donated in 1891, and the tower was designed by Benjamin Mountford, who designed a lot of the other buildings here in the Arts Centre, and it was completed in 1896. And here is an early picture of the tower as it was built in 1896 with the telescopes there inside the dome, and we'll go and see that very shortly. So the dome was actually made of canvas and wood, and that rotted away several times. So eventually a new design was made. It was a geodesic steel dome that was designed and constructed by the engineering department at the University of Canterbury in 1950. They put that steel dome on, and that's the dome that existed until the earthquake. So in 1896, James Townsend's colleague and friend, Walter Kitson, was given the job of the custodian of the telescope, and he received an honorarium of £50 a year for doing this. And he wrote in his journal, "I find it almost impossible to work the telescope entirely alone, and I'm obliged to employ my son to help, shifting shutters, etc. In term time, I have no doubt I should be able to secure the help of some student. It would be as well that some stated time should be fixed for my attendance, say between the hours of 7 and 10:30 p.m. on every Friday night." So his job was to open it for the public. People would come along, they would see the telescope, and he would tell them about the heavens. And much the same way, these days we've got very similar hours to these hours that were originally started in 1896. We run it from 8 till 10, and we employ our students to run these observing sessions. So it's the same situation as they had back then. So what astronomy has been done with the telescope? First of all, this is an address, an excerpt from a book, and it's the Philosophical Institute of Canterbury, and it's written by Professor Julius Von Haas. And he was the head of the Philosophical Institute of Canterbury at this time, 1877. He was the president, and this was his presidential address when he came in. So he was one of the first. Julius Von Haas was one of the first professors at the University of Canterbury College, as it was at the time, and he was a professor of geology. But he was the president of this Philosophical Institute, of which James Townsend was a member. And he'd been contacted by the Astronomer Royal. And the Astronomer Royal says, "We have this prediction that there's another planet inside Mercury's orbit, and we have a prediction that it will transit across the sun sometime in March 1877. So the Astronomer Royal wrote to a number of different places around the world saying, "Can you observe the sun during March the 21st to the 23rd all day to see if you can see the planet Vulcan travelling across the face of the sun?" And so that's what James Townsend did. He was asked by Professor Von Haas to do the observations, so he and his brother and a few other people, because it was 3 whole days, they sat and they looked at the sun, and they looked for anything that wasn't a sunspot, but that was a dark disk moving or transiting across the face of the sun. And they didn't see anything. No one else in the world saw anything either. And so this planet didn't exist. They thought it did, but in actual fact, there is no planet Vulcan. However, a few years later, well, not in our solar system anyway, so a few years later, the transit of Venus was observed. Now we know Venus exists. It's a nice bright star-like thing out there at the moment. So Venus is a planet that transits across the face of the sun about every 120 years. So in 1874 and in 1882, there were 2 transits, 8 years apart, and then you have to wait another 120 years till 2004 and 2012 for the next pair. So this is a photograph from 2012 when Venus transited across the face of the sun. It takes several hours for this to happen. And this is the transit of Venus observations that were done by James Townsend. On here, on the right, is James Townsend's observations with a small telescope, and the ones on the left are Walter Kitson's observations with the Cooke refractor telescope. So they used both telescopes at the same observatory, and they both observed Venus transiting across the face of the sun. And they made measurements, and measurements were made all around the world. And in fact, there's various books were produced. So here's one from Sydney Observatory, Sydney, New South Wales, The Transit of Venus, 1874, with diagrams about what they saw as Venus transited across the face of the sun. So they made measurements of these transits from various sites. Now, why would you want to do that? So the idea was to find out how far away the sun is exactly. It's a very hard measurement to make. So if you observe from the Earth and you observe Venus from two different points on the Earth, then you see it from a different perspective depending whereabouts you are on the Earth. And so if you're at a certain point, you'll see the transit up here. If you're at another point, you'll see the transit down here as Venus goes between the Earth and the sun. And so what you can do is by triangulation, by the parallax effect, you can work out, you can measure these transits, you can work out this angle, and therefore you can calculate the distance from the Earth to Venus and the Venus to the sun. So by that process of geometrical measurements and geometrical reasoning, you can work out the distance from the Earth to the sun, which was not well known. And so this was the whole point about doing this. You get one chance every 120 years to do this with the transit of Venus. And they got an answer. It took several years of calculations, because this is quite a tricky thing. Everything in this diagram is moving in different directions. So it took a couple of years for the calculations to be done, but the calculation for the distance from the Earth to the sun was correct to within 1% of the real accepted value these days. So that was quite an accomplishment for that time, and was done from a number of different observatories around the world. So what else can you see with the telescope? What else has been observed? Solar system objects are good. So when the moon is up, it's a very nice thing to look at. And when the planets are up, they're also very nice objects to see. So here is a report from the Star, Saturday, May the 13th in 1899. And some reporters have gone along to the observatory to see what they can see through the telescope. And this is the report they wrote up in the Star in the following days. An evening with a telescope. And Walter Kitson was the custodian. He was showing them the skies. So initially, they would have looked at the moon, and then Walter Kitson, who is in charge of the telescope, brought the largest of Earth's neighbours fairly into the field of view. And so this is what it looks like through the telescope if you get the chance to see Jupiter. You can see Jupiter, you can usually see the bands across Jupiter, across its equator where the clouds are moving. And you can usually see the 4 Galilean moons that orbit Jupiter. So here are 3 of the 4 moons, the little pinpricks of light surrounding Jupiter. And by working out the positions of these and to measuring the positions of these and how long it takes to orbit around Jupiter, you can work out the mass of Jupiter from Kepler's laws. So anything that has orbiting bodies can be used in this way. You apply Kepler's laws. If you can measure the period and you can measure the distance, then you can work out the mass that is the body that's being orbited. So in this case, we can work out the mass of Jupiter from this observation, or from a series of observations like this. What else do they look at? Walter Kitson then moves the telescope onto this part of the sky, which is quite recognisable. Here's the pointers in the Southern Cross. And this dark area here is called the Coalsack Nebula. This bright pointer is called Alpha Centauri. So this night, they also looked at this part of the sky, and they said the best known of the constellations of the south is probably the Southern Cross. Few people looking even carefully at the brightest of the 5 stars, Alpha Crucis, as it's called, would imagine that it consists of 2 stars or suns very close together and probably belonging to one solar system. Yet the telescope speedily reveals the 2 brilliantly flashing points of light. So through the telescope, you'll be able to see that this is a binary star system with a brighter star and a fainter star. And that's Alpha Crucis. If you now go to Alpha Centauri, you'll also see that this is also a binary system. And this was something that was very common to explore at this time. Observations of the sun were important. You could see the sunspots, see the activity of the sun. You could look at the planets and see things like the orbits of the moons. And you can look at star systems and stars. And if you see that they're binary stars, you can measure the positions of the 2 stars and you can work out the orbits. And that was what this telescope had, a special binary star measuring mechanism to work out the positions of the two stars and how separated they were. So if you looked at Alpha Centauri, you would see two stars reasonably well separated and with a certain angle. So you can measure how separated these are and at what angle they are from each other with the special binary star measuring mechanism attached to this telescope. Alpha Centauri, Mr. Kitson said, as far as it is at present known, the nearest star to the solar system. You can put its distance down roughly to 18 billions of miles, he said. Or to put it another way, light takes about 3.5 years to travel from that star to us. And that's pretty accurate. They knew at that stage this was the closest star. It's a binary star system, and they were able to make measurements of actually what the orbit was. It has an 80-year orbit period, so it takes a long time to make that measurement of that binary star orbit. So you can do that. If you have star A, star B appears to make an orbit in 80 years about star A.
So what is the distance from Earth to Sun?
150 million kilometres. That's not an accurate number, but it's close enough. But they got it more accurately than that when they did the measurement.
Just trying to get some distance between the...
Right. Yeah, so 150 million kilometres is an astronomical unit. Is that right? Yeah? Yep, we have... I'll ask the astronomy students, they'll know that off the top of their head. Yeah. And yeah, so from these binary stars, we're able to work out orbits by applying Kepler's laws once again to the binary stars. In the same constellation is a very faint star known as Kappa Crucius, and the telescope was next pointed at that. It's difficult to believe that a star that's practically insignificant beside magnificent suns like the dog star Sirius could contain such a wealth of hidden treasures. Seen through the telescope, it appeared as if the most brilliant of sapphires and rubies with diamonds of the first water had been scattered with lavish hand over the field of view. There could be but one opinion that Kappa Crucius deserved the name with which it had been christened, the jewel cluster. And we call this the jewel box. And this is a picture taken through the Townsend Telescope. It's one of the youngest clusters known. It's a cluster of young stars. They've just been born, so they're only about 10 million years old. So very young by astronomical terms. And it has lots of different coloured stars. There's one particularly orangey red star, which means it's a very cool surface. So if you see a red star like that, it has a cool surface temperature of about 3,000 degrees. So very cool. Whereas these other ones, these bright white ones, this bluish white coloured ones, they have very hot surface temperatures. We can tell that it's about 10,000 degrees, the surface temperature of those stars. But these are all young stars. They've just been born. They're still in the group, the family group they were born with. Star clusters are really useful because we can see the way different stars evolve and the different rates at which they evolve. And the thing that governs how they evolve is mass. So the larger mass stars evolve more quickly, the smaller mass stars evolve more slowly. Okay, so those are the objects that Kitson showed through the telescope. They're the typical objects that we would show these days through the same telescope, and we get the same views. The optics of the telescope are really nice. You get a really nice view of the moon, of the planets, and of stars, binary stars and clusters. Until 2010 and then 2011, we had the Canterbury earthquakes. So this is the Observatory Tower, photographed in February 2011 by Dale Kershaw. There was quite a lot of cracking in the tower, and they were stabilising the tower. They had scaffolding around it, and they were trying to sort out how they could stabilise it to make sure it didn't fall over. But then, very shortly after this photo was taken, we had the second earthquake, the one in February the 22nd. And you can see here, the whole tower has peeled away from the building and collapsed down. And all the scaffolding here, I want you to see the scaffolding here is quite straight with all the boards on it. And in the centre, sitting there, there's the dome, more or less in one piece, more or less intact. So I was sent these photos by Rowan Buxton, who was a member of the USAR task force. He sent them to me a few days after the earthquake, because he knew I was the director of the observatory. And looking at this, I was first horrified, and then I was hopeful that because the dome was intact and all the scaffolding was still straight, that perhaps the telescope had landed and not been damaged too much. And you can even see there's a car here underneath all this straight scaffolding. Unfortunately, a few days after this, the USAR team sent in a digger and dug up all the rubble to search for bodies, and it resulted in this mess. All the scaffolding is now corkscrewed, all the rocks have sort of been moved around. The dome has been completely flattened, and we went in here. This is the 29th of March. Me and Graham and Dale, his wife, went in to look at the telescope. We searched through all this rubble, couldn't find the telescope anywhere, not one little piece of it. So where is the telescope? We didn't know where it was. I started ringing around scrap metal yards, the council, USAR, anyone I could get hold of, saying, where's the telescope? Couldn't find. The only thing we found was the big heavy plinth that it was attached to. So eventually we found out that someone had actually picked the pieces up and moved them into a nearby room. One of these buildings, they'd moved it into a nearby building, but it was in very poor condition, and obviously it had been run over a few times by a grader. And so here are some of the pieces of the telescope, the original telescope. You can see here, this one had a fairly rough time of it, and this is the finder scope. You can see it's not very straight anymore. So some pieces you can see in the diagram in the picture here, some pieces are really quite munched, other pieces don't seem to be hurt much at all. It just depended. So the Art Centre found all the pieces. They found every single little piece. That there was a few minor screws and things that were missing, but eventually the whole telescope was found, and then it was delivered to Graham Kershaw, and they said, here's your telescope. And Graham's not quite sure what to do with it at that stage. So here's some pictures. This is the clock mechanism that we showed you working before. This is one of those big wheel gears, and you can see here it's been quite graunched by something hitting it. And here is a lot of pieces of the telescope. Some are in quite good condition, and other ones have obviously been hit by something quite significant at that time. Okay, so what was amazing, what was a miracle, was when Graham took his lens cover off, which is the first job he had built, was making the lens cover. When he pulled the lens cover off, the lens was completely intact. And because a telescope is defined by its lenses, it doesn't really matter what's holding the lenses apart. We could effectively, at this point, we could say the lens is perfect, it's completely intact, we can rebuild the telescope because the heart of the telescope is still there. The lenses are complete. So we decided to do that. We went through a fundraising campaign, concentrating on restoring this unique piece of Christchurch's astronomical history and heritage. And it took a few years, and it took a large donation from UC alumnus Professor David Teece, his wife Lee, and their family. They also contributed to the Teece Museum of Antiquities, of course, but they donated a significant amount of money that allowed the restoration to take place, and that happened in 2015. So Graham Kershaw got working on the restoration of the telescope in 2016. So he'd just retired after 50 years in the Department of Physics. He was working in his garage, restoring the telescope. Some parts he couldn't fix and he had to reproduce, and other parts he could straighten out. So here he is in April or sometime between 2016 and 2018 restoring the telescope. So this picture was taken in 2017. Graham essentially had completed the whole telescope with the finder scope and all the adjustment rods. He'd also completed the clock drive mechanism that was all in working condition, when suddenly and unexpectedly Graham fell ill and he died quite quickly. And so we were still halfway through the restoration. He'd completed the telescope and the clock mechanism, but all the gears that moved the telescope around hadn't been touched yet. So we had to find someone else to do that work, and we got Quentin Rowe in to do that work. He's the son of an ex-technician in the department, and he worked on these two large gears that drive the telescope, that move the telescope around. And here he is working on the worm and the wheel mechanism, making sure that meshes together and is able to drive the telescope. So he was able to do that work and finish that at the end of 2022. This is Orlin Pedersen, who's our IT person in the department. He also has a PhD in astronomy, and he knows a lot about telescopes, so he helped with the assembly and the alignment of the telescope once it was completed. And Dale Kershaw, Graham's wife, she finished the restoration of the plinth that holds the telescope up. And there were many other contributions. So finally, in 2023, we're able to have the restored telescope back in place in this restored tower, which is a whole nother story, is the restoration of the tower, but I won't talk about that. The telescope is beautiful. It's back in great condition. You can see the shiny brass and the battleship grey colours of the telescope. This is a picture taken by Orlin in 2023 when it was first put in place in the observatory dome. And we employed some observers in March 2023. Here they are, getting their picture taken. They now know how to use the telescope. They'll show you tonight the operation of the telescope, and I'm not quite sure how cloudy it is. It was quite getting, we may or may not be able to see anything, but you'll certainly be able to see the telescope. So this restoration process has taken a while. It's been 12 years of not being able to use it, but now it's there, it's back, and it's in one piece. It's operational, and we're starting these open nights again, Friday nights, during winter, with the students doing the observation sessions. So this restoration will enable the people of Christchurch and the visitors to enjoy stargazing through this beautiful and historic telescope once again. Seeing objects like this on a clear night. And yeah, so we're running these sessions every clear night until September, when it gets, when daylight saving sort of comes in and it's too light. And our students will be running these sessions every Friday night. So that's a little bit about the history of the telescope, some of the observations it's done and what you would see through the telescope. And finally, we now have a restored telescope back in this historic place. So the plan for this evening is now to split you into groups, and we'll take groups of 16 people up to the telescope. So we can only take 16 at a time. So we'll take 2 observers up and they will operate the telescope. And we may or may not be able to see something, but you'll be able to certainly see the telescope itself. So, thank you. So I hope you appreciate the telescope. If you'll arrange the first group of 16 to go up.
This is pretty even split, so we'll go this side of the room first and then this group. So yeah, you guys can go.
So while you're looking at the telescope, we'll do a question and answer session with the other group. Some of the observers will stay behind, so they're astronomy students. They're quite happy to talk about their projects. I'm quite happy to show some videos of Mount John and answer questions, and then we can swap groups.
People were honestly saying that it could have been destroyed by diggers and not by the falling of stone.
Yeah, so we're not sure what damage was done by the diggers and what damage was done by actually falling down, because certainly when the tower fell down, all the scaffolding was straight. The pictures I saw, the dome was intact. When we went to see it just a few weeks later, the scaffolding was corkscrewed, you know, the car. Not finding the telescope was heartbreaking. We were frantic. We didn't know what had happened to it. We thought someone had sort of said, oh, brass or something, we'll flog it off. So we didn't know what had happened to it. It took us quite a while. I'll show you a picture going back through here of the earthquakes. So one thing I did do is soon after the earthquake, Google Map did a photo of Christchurch, so you could see what things had been damaged. And so I downloaded the Google Map from the 24th of February, so 2 days after the earthquake, of the art centre, because I wanted to know what had happened to the telescope. And so you can see here, this is where the tower's fallen. You can see the shiny dome there. So, and that's sort of what I got that picture of from Rowan, showing the dome sitting on top of that scaffolding. So from the Google Map, I could see that the dome was there, and I thought, well, if the dome's intact, and and the telescope may have suffered some slight damage, but hopefully it might, be in one piece with that scaffolding sort of supporting it. But yeah, by the time we got to it, it was quite different. It was, the dome was there, the car was also flattened, scaffolding was corkscrewed, and no sign of the telescope. So it took us a while to find it, but yeah, the Art Centre staff were great. They sifted through all the pieces. They found virtually every little screw, even the donation box. They found all the coins in the donation box. All was delivered to Graham and said, "Here you go, Graham. There's a retirement project for you."
So is he holding the lens?
So he is holding the lens there. Yeah. So we'd pulled the lens cap off while Orlon was there. Orlon was there when that happened.
Graham and I, we'd just received it. It was in our loading bay. It was sitting on a pallet. It was a particularly sad sight to see. But we did see the top hat and housing for the lens looked to be all intact. It was still attached to part of the telescope tube, so we couldn't actually look from the other end to see if it was all right. So we had to get a mallet out to actually get the top hat off. But yes, we were very, very pleasantly surprised to see that the lens, apart from some dust, was largely as it was. So we didn't do much more than give it a good bit of a clean. And, it was been in a state pretty much ready to go since we got it.
Yeah, so being carefully kept away in the corner until it could be put back in the telescope. Yeah?
Can you tell us a little bit about the lens itself and how it's built and why it's so important? I mean, obviously that's the thing you're looking through, but what's the mechanics behind the lens?
So it's a good question, and I don't completely know the full answer to that. I mean, just going back to look at Thomas Cook. So Thomas Cook was a brilliant optician, and where is he? Yep, there he is. So he was a brilliant optician and telescope maker. He'd made numerous telescopes before in various designs. So this telescope lens is 6 inches in diameter, and it's an achromat, which means that it has several pieces of glass welded together so that there's no chromatic aberration. So the problems with a normal convex lens is it brings light to a focus, but different coloured lights comes to different focuses, so that the red light focuses at a different point than the blue light. So you get what we call chromatic aberration. So depending on the colour of the light, you see the colour of the light focusing at different points. So you get little colourful halos around the objects you're looking at. However, if you put a convex lens with a sort of concave lens in the right combination, you can correct for that chromatic aberration. And so that's what this lens was, a particular sequence of lenses that corrected for that and gives you really good optical images. And he was a fine optician. He was one of the finest opticians at the time, and he also specialised in making optics for telescopes. And so he had a great mechanical engineering department that made all these gears. And when Quentin was doing the restoration of the gear work, he was just saying he was in awe of the people that made it. In 1864, manually making the gear and the optics as well, manually grinding the optics to this perfect figure, and making sure that all the optical problems are ironed out with the design of the optics. So yeah, it was a skill and a craftsmanship that, yeah, Quentin was saying he just enjoyed working and just thinking about the people from the past, how, the different situation they would have been in from him with his sort of power tools in the workshop, that what they did was everything was done by hand and very, very craftsmanlike, yeah. Yeah.
Is the term Centauris is a term of astronomy or astrology?
Sorry, what was that?
Centauris.
Centauris, yes, that's the constellation of the Centaur. Yep.
Is astronomy or astrology?
Well, we do astronomy. You can do astrology, but
What's the origin of the word?
So Alpha Centauri, there you go. So this is the nearest star to our solar system, Alpha Centauri. It's actually a triple star system. So there's the binary star that you can see, and there's also a dim red star that goes around it. So what we were looking at before was how you can do science by looking at these binary stars, and by applying Kepler's laws. And by applying Kepler's laws and studying by studying the orbit of the star, you can get information about its orbit and things like that. So this is Alpha Centauri. That's the two stars as you may see them. Right now they're quite close to each other in the sky, but they get further apart with time. It takes 80 years for that to happen. And by doing that measurement of the exact position and the exact distance of separation, you can draw this orbit. And then from looking at how long it takes the star to orbit, you can work out what the actual orbit is in reality, rather than being projected in the sky. So that's the science of astronomy. So it's a physics applied to stars. Astrology is something else.
But the three bodies are unpredictable.
No, they're not. That they are predictable. So we can see here the orbit of the Alpha Centauri A and B, and then at a very, very large distance there's another little red star called Proxima Centauri, which is actually the closest star to us, and they've found planets around it, but it's much smaller and dimmer. These are the two bright stars in the system, but it actually is a triple system, which makes it quite interesting. Any other questions? Yeah. Yeah, sure. Go ahead. Yeah.
So we have the first lens that are glass and beautifully built.
Yeah.
How is technology changing these devices? Because that seems and sounds very ancient, but still very efficient.
Yeah.
How is technology changing how we observe the stars?
So these days, what happened is, to get and look at fainter and fainter objects, you need a bigger and bigger telescope with a bigger and bigger lens. So you had to make bigger telescopes, you had to make bigger lenses. Bigger lenses are very heavy. And what they found is when they start getting very, very large telescopes, they're very, very long and unwieldy, very hard to use. And the lenses are very heavy and they almost bent the telescope. So they're looking at ways to make low density glass for the bigger and bigger telescopes. So the problem was building bigger telescopes meant bigger lenses, and that had raised lots of issues. These days, most modern telescopes will be mirrors. So rather than having the lens as the optical component, we use mirrors, and we focus light with mirrors rather than using lenses. And these can be made very short and small and quite compact. And most modern telescopes will be these very short, compact, huge mirrors, so you can see great distances, but usually computer controlled these days as well, but everything will be mirrors, and there will be some optical components with lenses in them, particularly cameras and other instruments that go on the telescope, but usually the telescope will be made of mirrors rather than lenses. So, yeah.
Yep. Could you tell us a bit about what kind of telescope is that Matatiki Observatory?
Yeah, I had a little video that I played earlier, so I'll see if I can find one that shows them. So here's one from earlier. And so this will show you, hopefully, some of the telescopes. Does this show the telescopes, this one? So they're all reflectors. They're all reflector telescopes. We have 4 telescopes. This one, they range in size from 60 centimetres, so 60 centimetres across is the diameter of the mirror, through to 1.8 metres, which is the diameter of the largest one. So we have 2 60 centimetre ones. So this is the 1 metre telescope. It's a bit hard to see, but it's 1 metre diameter. And that was built in New Zealand. We designed that in the Department of Physics. And the lenses, well, the mirror was figured in Wellington at the DSIR, as it was at the time. It's now Callaghan Innovation or Kiwi Star Optics. They made the mirrors for this telescope here. So this telescope was installed in 1986. This one here is the Moa, 1.8 metres, and this one's the Boller and Shivens, that's 60 centimetres. Anyway, does that answer your question?
Yeah. So, are you working on some international collaborations?
Yeah, most of the projects would be, you can ask the students what they're doing. So we have quite a number of international collaborations. The Moa telescope is a Japanese-New Zealand collaboration. The 1 metre telescope, I've got quite a few collaborators from overseas, and we have different interests. I'm looking at a binary system, but it's actually a binary of binaries. So there's 2 binary stars, and they're going around each other. So it's a quadruple star system, and we're trying to work out exactly what the periods are of all the binaries in this system. So that's another international collaboration. Do you guys want to stand up and talk a little bit about what you're doing? So just a minute, if you could say what you're doing at the moment.
Okay, yeah.
You're Ethan?
Yes, I'm Ethan. I'm doing my honours at the moment. I'm currently doing Galactic Archeology under Claire Worley, and basically what I'm doing is I'm getting a big data set, looking at lots of different stars in the Milky Way and applying machine learning algorithms to try and learn about different trends that we might see in different parts of the galaxy, and what we can figure out about how the composition of stars, and based on where they are and how old they are, and just trends like that using computers rather than trying to figure it out by hand.
So Ethan uses the 1 metre telescope, and it has a spectrograph attached to it, which means that you can look at the spectrum, and the spectrum tells you the chemical composition of the star.
Yeah, so and then we also use that to do, we're doing a solar volume survey as well. It's just looking at lots of sun-like stars and just trying to learn as much as we can about them using the spectrograph. So how they might change over time, or what they're made out of, just stuff like that, or using the spectrograph. It's called Hercules. It's attached to 1 metre. It's very big, fitting name, I think.
Yeah, that's right, yeah. And Quinn, do you want to say what you're doing?
Yeah, I'm working with Karen on something called AP stars, which are A-type peculiar stars. The stars they've got giant spots on their surfaces, which we can use spectra and images from the other telescopes to measure rotation periods, and I want to try and work out some stuff about their magnetic fields, which we can do using the Hercules spectrograph as well. Yeah, that's a rundown of what I do.
Yep, good. So there are two others, Zach and Heather, who are with the other group at the moment. Did you want to say anything, Orlon?
Yes, Orlon Peterson. I did my various degrees in astronomy. A couple of things I looked at. Basically, I was doing spectroscopy, so using our spectrograph on the 1 metre telescope, and actually I used two different spectrographs. One of my first projects was looking at protoplanetary systems. So in particular, one we were looking at is one of the best known Beta Pictoris, which is a second brightest star in the constellation of Pictor. It was the first star where what we were able to do was basically block out the light from the star, and then that directly, and then you were able to actually see the disk of dust from which planets can form around the star. And while I wasn't doing that kind of work, what I was doing was looking at the spectra of the star and watching changes in two particular spectral lines, which were showing these objects that appeared to be running around the star itself. The interpretation then, and still holds today, is what we were seeing were effectively our comets going around this other star and blocking out part of the light from the star, pretty much like eclipsing of like the transit of Venus, same sort of thing. We were able to see these streams of objects, lots of them. So that's more or less, we think, that these comets effectively were what we call protoplanetary or planetesimals, building blocks that go on to make planets. Subsequently, other people have gone on to find that Beta Pictoris actually has several planets. The other thing I also studied was I looked at what are called Cepheid variable stars. Cepheid variables are stars that are getting towards the end of their life cycle. They're in a particular stage of their evolution where they undergo a radial pulsation, so the star just expands and contracts in a regular manner. And one of the things I was doing was looking at ones that were in binary systems to better nail down the masses of the stars, because if you knew the mass of the star very well and you also know the pulsation period, you get to learn a lot of fundamental characteristics of these stars, and would then resolve a number of contentious issues over how stars evolve. So, yeah.
Thank you. Yep, any other questions? Yeah?
Yeah, there was an ideology called relativism. That means there's no objective truth. Everything depends on perspective.
Yep.
Can the science of astronomy disprove that?
I don't know how to answer that question. I don't know what this theory
For
is.
example, in your domain, do you believe there's an objective truth?
Yes. I think you can measure things. I think you can do experiments. I think you can work out characteristics of objects. You can apply the laws of physics to different objects and get lots of interesting information about our universe from observational astronomy.
Like several months ago, there was an American astronomist who came here to give a lecture as well. I asked him about astronomy and astrology. She told me that there was no clear line between this one because some Indian astrology can have very precise prediction.
I would probably argue against that. Astrology and astronomy used to be the same sort of thing several thousand years ago, but astronomy these days essentially is applying physics to star systems, galaxies, the universe. So it really is just a branch of physics, whereas astrology is not. Yep.
Just coming back to what you guys discussed. So, like, do you sit at the island campus and people send data through, or are you basically living at Tekapo and like getting data each night and then analysing it the next day? Like, how does that work?
So I schedule the science on the telescope. So all the students and staff will apply for time on different telescopes for the next coming 3 months. And on the 1 metre telescope, it's scheduled every night of the year. So there's someone observing every night of the year. So the students might go down for a couple of weeks to observe, a week, maybe 2 weeks, and observe, come back and analyse their data. We also have some technicians who get observations for projects. If you need more observations than you can actually go down and get, we have observing technicians who will get extra data for you or get your own data. But the 1 metre telescope is scheduled every night, and the MOA telescope is also operating every night that's clear. The 2 smaller telescopes, the Optical Craftsman telescope is robotic, so it has a list of objects that it observes, and it's all computer controlled. It's all robotic. It goes through its program, what's visible, and it observes it automatically, opens up, observes it, and closes down at the end of the night. So it will observe any clear night it can. The other telescope, the Boller and Shivens, is not scheduled every single night of the year. It's there's still some free nights on it, but it's used quite a lot for different imaging projects. That's a telescope that has very nice optics. We do a lot of teaching on that telescope, so we'll take students down and we'll show them how to use that telescope and how to use the imaging cameras on that. But yeah, you usually go down for a week at a time maybe, and as often as you need to get the data for your project, and then you'll bring it back to Christchurch and spend most of your time at Christchurch in front of a computer, working out what it all means and sort of modelling it and sort of reducing it to a useful format. But yeah, we do have technicians that can get extra data as well. And there are some things that you can do on different nights, and there are some things that you have to observe on a particular night. It's only visible on a particular night. So some things are time critical, and some things you can observe any time. So different types of observing have different priorities.
Just one other extra question around that. So, do other New Zealand universities have astronomy departments, and do they use Mount John, or how does that part work?
Yeah, so essentially we're the de facto national observatory. We're the main professional observatory in New Zealand, and so we have astronomers from Auckland come down and Victoria come down and use the telescopes. So yeah, de facto we operate as the national observatory, even though we get no funding for that. It's all funded by the University of Canterbury. So yeah, it would be nice to be nationally funded, but yeah, we essentially act as a national observatory. In that way, we do get international astronomers asking us to make observations because we're in a particular unique place in New Zealand. We're a long way south, a lot further south than any other professional observatory, apart from Antarctica. But all the other southern hemisphere sites are at 30 degrees south. We're at 45 south, so we're a lot further south. So we often get requests to observe particular objects, particularly, yeah, if they can't see them or if something interesting's happening, we can observe them with our telescope. So we get a lot of collaborations that way. Astronomy is taught in other departments, mostly probably theoretical. You can get observations from space telescopes. You don't have to use ground-based telescopes. So that's another way of getting data, is having collaborators who have access to a telescope. Okay, next group.
We've been running these open nights for 127 years, minus 12. Yeah, we don't operate on cloudy nights. We changed the format this year from how it used to run, so we don't operate on cloudy nights anymore. but every time it's clear, we try to. So, the telescope itself, this is that clock drive that they were talking about. It drives this gear, this main central gear, and it pulls the telescope around so it's always looking at the same point of the sky as the Earth rotates. What else?
Does that mean the whole dome rotates?
Yes. So we can move it here.
So, do you manually rotate
Yes.
that?
Yeah.
That is a bit disorientating.
Oh, glory! Then again, that was hilarious. Oh my god. That's cool.
We should try it. It's try.
You see
No, that cloud
I
is
can see
actually,
up
the
the
gap
right
is
there.
coming. It's
Oh,
kind
yeah.
of blowing.
We'll try it. May as well.
How far is that?
Keep going. You have to go quite a bit away.
Okay.
Which one is it?
Oh, we do. We can see 2 stars.
Oh, great. Cool. Okay, we're going to get people through as quick as we can, so the cloud doesn't get in the way. So we're looking through this eyepiece here.
Please don't touch the telescope.
Do you want to
Do you need your glasses on or not?
lock the RA, or should we?
Well, I will.
Yeah, leave your glasses on.
Yes, please.
So to look through the telescope,
I can see.
you can put your eye right up to the eyepiece, so you don't have to stand ages away.
No,
Close
I
one
can
eye
see.
and
It's
keep the other
amazing.
open.
Looks like a street lamp.
You should be able to
Right.
see 2 stars.
Yes, so there should be 2.
Yeah, you can definitely see 2.
Yeah. Do you want to turn the white light off?
It's so tiny. They're so close to each other.
Yeah. So Karen did say before